These are actually quite exciting times for the Métis Nation, and I'm going to talk about the important work that the Métis Nation of Alberta has ahead of you. I want to start with talking about, I think, what Aaron spoke about earlier, talking about the story. Because if you don't understand how we got here and what our story is as the Métis Nation, you don't understand why this next stage or period in our history is so important. And I think people need to understand the struggle, and people need to understand the journey, because everyone throws around words like self-government, throws around words like constitution, and you don't understand, though, this is a continuation of the struggles that began in 1816, in 1869 and 70, in 1885, and continue to this day. And we may not be picking up guns or doing armed resistance anymore. In fact, for the last 15 years, we've been in the courts fighting for recognition and making sure that our inherent right of self-government and self-determination is recognized. But what's really important now is the work that the Métis in Alberta need to do to kind of bring it finally across the plate and achieve the vision that Riel and leaders over the generations have had for the Métis. I'm going to break my presentation into 5 sections and go through it very quickly. Métis history in 200 years, in 5 minutes or less. I'm going to start with the birth of the Métis Nation and understanding where our right to self-government comes from. I'm going to talk about the era of broken promises, colonialism, and dispossession. I'm going to talk about organizing and rebuilding to defend our rights in that era in the early 1900s and mid-1900s. I'm going to talk about the recognition of Métis rights and what we've dubbed our hunt for justice in the courts that was over a period. And then I want to talk about what I think is a new era, at least we hope, which is about reestablishing that nation-to-nation relationship and finally implementing that inherent right to self-government and self-determination. I'm going to talk about the birth of the Métis Nation because I think it's key to understanding where our rights come from, as well as why we're moving forward in this way. And so here's just some of the things of whether it's the battles in 1816, whether it's the laws of the hunt, which I think are going to be talked about more this afternoon, whether it's the Provisional Council that's established in 1869 and 70 in the Red River. And I think what's really key to all of this, though, is the Métis Nation, which is born in Western Canada, has all of the indicia that are needed to be a people at international law and an Indigenous people. And I think that's what makes us very, very different than other groups that may claim to be Métis or other organizations. We have this constitutional base, this peoplehood that brings our communities, whether they're in northwestern Ontario to southern Alberta, together in a common narrative. And I think that that story or that peoplehood is what grounds why we have fought for generations to say we're not just the adjunct relatives of First Nations, and that we have, based upon that peoplehood, we have a right to self-government and self-determination. And so why are we a people? We have a shared history, a distinct culture and way of life, customary laws and governance, a language, territory, and most importantly, and it's not, is a constant permutation of identification of a people, standing up and fighting and pushing back when colonization rolls westward, pushing back when our lands are taken from us, pushing back in the courts when we know that there's been constitutional promises made to us that have been broken. And I think that is what distinguishes the Métis from other groups, is that constant collective assertion of a consciousness, political action, and also recognition by others as a people. And I think that underlying that is why we say we have the inherent right of self-government and self-determination. And I've put up here the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which reaffirms that in international law. But it's what Riel and leaders over the generations have constantly struggled with. Canada lives in a denial. Canada, to a large extent, is based upon a fiction. The story I was told when I was in grade school, and I don't think it's changed that much in the curriculum, is largely based upon lies. It's from a perspective of, well, this is how Canada was created and built, and it's very often the Indigenous perspective is not in that story. Now, we're slowly rewriting it, and for the youth in here, I kind of see colonization as kind of a virus that gets into a program, and it rewrites the code, right? It's kind of, no, this is a lake that we've always called X, but then after colonization gets in there and it recodes, it's like, it's named after this white guy's wife because she's been here for 20 minutes, but it's erased all of the history and the code that lies underneath, which is our stories and our connection to the land. And I think that what we're doing in this process of reconciliation is rewriting that code. We're trying to tell truths about what this country is built upon, and we're also trying to finally negotiate the correct relationship, or the relationship that Riel envisioned with Canada. And it's hard work, and it's been a long slog, but I think that when we talk about why are we developing a constitution and why are we doing this work, that's the only way that we're going to rewrite that code so it has some truth within it, and also to a certain extent, and I'll show this later, put us back on the map. Because often those boundaries have divided our nationhood, they've erased our places, and they've erased our homeland. After that birth of the Métis Nation as a people in 1816 and the continuation and the events in Red River in 1869 and 70, what you have is a history of broken promises, dispossession, and colonization. And I think that this is, and I just want to show some of this deeply embedded biases that lie within our country. So this is a map, and I took this map from a grade 8 history studies book that is still in circulation. And I think it's kind of interesting. And when you kind of see this of like, oh, well, here's Canada in 1867, and here's Rupert's Land in the Northwest Territories. But what we don't recognize is the bias that's built into this map, right? The grayed out, Canada's where all the action is over here about what they've created in the East. But they kind of go, oh, and here's the Northwest or Rupert's Land. And what's often missing from here is the perspective of the people that are actually on the land. So I love this quote from Riel, and he says, when the government of Canada presented itself at the doors, it found us at peace. It found the Métis people of the Northwest could not only live well without it, but that it had a government of its own, free, peaceful, well-functioning, contributing to the work of civilization in a way the company in England could never have done with 1,000 soldiers. It was a government with an organized constitution, and let's emphasize that, an organized constitution, whose junction was more legitimate and worthy of respect because it was exercised over a country that belonged to it. And I think that's really important because that's left off the map, right? Oh, it's this grayed out area. There's nothing there. In fact, there's deep laws, traditions, history there. And it's often ignored, or it's seen as lesser than or inferior to what's coming westward, what's coming from the East. And we simply know that's not the truth. So this is Riel's vision of what he thinks happening, and this is Sir John A's vision of what he's writing to one of his drinking buddies in one of his journals, and this comes from the Manitoba Métis Federation case, and he says, it will require considerable management to keep those wild people down. That's you. Everyone in this room, that's you. You're those wild people because it stops that virus that is colonization. We're pushing back against it. I think but that's the starting point. And at the beginning part of the relationship in 1869 and 70, Canada needed us. There was no way through. There was no way to Sir John A's vision of building a railway. It was never going to be achieved without Métis consent, Métis becoming a part of this country. And that deal, which is often referred to as a treaty, and Riel refers to it as two societies, one great, but having no greater rights than the other, coming together and forging a partnership. That was supposed to be a partnership. And a partnership isn't kind of, okay, well, what's the promise I need to do to get me through the day? And then I'll breach it as soon as it's over. And whether it was that deliberate or not, it was pretty clear, though, there was never an intention to keep that partnership. And we've been digging ourselves out from those breaches over the last 150 years. So here's the original promise of the Section 31, 1.4 million acres of land promised to the Métis in the Red River settlement and in what was the old postage stamp province of Manitoba. And of course, as soon as they get their promise, that deal is delayed, not fulfilled, and the children, or the idea of creating a homeland, which it would represent almost 14% of the land mass within that postage stamp, never comes to be. And of course, we have the Battle of Batoche, or in 1885, of another Métis resistance of pushing back. And what comes out of that, which is part of the story within Alberta, is the implementation of the scrip system. But it's once again that coding, that virus of all the scrip system is about land dispossession. It's not about the promise that's embedded with the 1870 order about the transfer of Rupert's land, is about equitable principles of just settlement and dealing with the Indigenous peoples. But what's actually created is a system that's all about dispossession and getting people off the land, Indigenous people off the land, and getting it into the hands of non-Indigenous people. It's like a giant land laundering scheme that is so rife with fraud and speculation and injustice that the Supreme Court of Canada has already called it a sorry chapter in our nation's history. And of course here, which many of us have within our families, is a scrip coupon, which is part of that paper process of dispossessing our people from the land. But let's not forget that that is the root cause of why that relationship goes so awry. And we can never forget that scrip, there will be no reconciliation with the Métis Nation in Western Canada without resolution on the scrip issue. For the Manitoba Métis, it was about clearly Section 31 needs to be dealt with and recognized. There will never be justice or reconciliation with the Métis within Alberta without finding resolution on the scrip issue. And it goes part and parcel to self-government and a modern-day land claim or treaty with the Métis, because we'll never forget, and it is what created that power imbalance and large dispossession of our people from the lands. This is a quote from the Royal Commission report, and it's from the people that own themselves to being the road allowance people, and it's all about that code, that virus that infects the lands, which is colonization. And this is from the RCAP. While they were never well off, Indian people at least had their reserves and benefited from various social services provided by the Government of Canada. Not so the Métis. In the earliest 20th century, the circumstances of Alberta Métis were especially grim in central and northern regions. Game was scarce, prohibitive, expensive fishing licenses were required. The white settlement was spreading remorselessly. The majority of the Métis were reduced to squatting on the fringes of Indian reserves and white settlements and on road allowances. The independent ones, who had been the diplomats and brokers of the Northwest, were now referred to as the road allowance people. And that is the result of those broken promises, colonization, and dispossession. And that is what we have been digging ourselves out from. And that is the resurgence that you see within Alberta in the early 1900s of Métis coming together to organize again. Because this wasn't unlike the deal negotiated in 1869 and 70. No one negotiated scrip. This was unilaterally imposed by the federal government as a means to achieve their goals, never from a consent perspective of the Métis actually saying what is the intention of the promise. I think that the next era that you see the Métis Nation go through is this organization and rebuilding, and you have a proud history here in Métis, in Alberta. You have the settlements of the organization of coming together to secure a land base for Métis, and you also have the creation of the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Métis Association of Alberta, one of the oldest of the Métis National Council's governing members, and you organize and rebuild, and you still with not a recognition from governments that you have the inherent right to self-government, that respect is not there. It's we know we have it and will always have it as a people, but it's always been about finally getting to a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship with Canada to ensure and to protect Métis rights and the Métis Nation for generations to come. And this rebuilding period is what has contributed to, as I said, the creation of the settlements, to all of the institutions and good programs and services that the Métis Nation of Alberta has been able to deliver over the years. But it's not enough. You have huge gaps. You have areas where you need to do more work. And it also has never been on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. It's been based upon, well, here's the federal government's programs, and maybe we'll let you deliver them. The next phase that we have is the recognition of Métis rights as a collective, of the Métis Nation as a people within Section 35. And also what we thought with, and here's a photo of Harry Daniels, one of a former board member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and also one of the key leaders who were able to secure this second recognition of the Métis within Canada's Constitution. But we thought that Section 35 was supposed to change everything. There were constitutional conferences after in the late 80s, and there was the Métis Nation Accord in the early 1990s. And when those failed to get results, what essentially we saw governments do is they walked away. They walked away from the table. They kind of said, oh, well, Section 35 is a me fool you promise. It got us through the day in 1982. We put you in there to appease you, but it's an empty box. And I think and Métis, not because we wanted to or because we actually go and seek answers to these questions from the courts. It's just as opposed to picking up arms in the modern day, we turn to the courts in what we called our hunt for justice to say, no, Section 35 has meaning. Things were supposed to change. You recognized us as a distinct Indigenous people, and it's not an empty box. You have to sit down and negotiate. And I think through a series of cases from Powley in 2003 to Manitoba Métis Federation in 2013 to Daniels in 2016, we've been using the courts to nudge, cajole, kick governments to finally say, you need to come through here. And I just want to say, we've never turned to the answers for courts. The courts will never define who we are. Lawyers will never define who we are. Academics will never define who we are. The people will define who we are. And we have been using the courts as a tool to get to the table where it's handed back to the Métis to get to that negotiation. And I think that it's really important to always remember that the courts should be irrelevant to us in our negotiations because it was a means to an end. It shouldn't provide the parameters or the square boxes that we should be thinking within. And as one of the lawyers who's been up in the courts arguing that, courts are ill-equipped. They cannot deal with these issues. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People was always very clear that courts are actually, should not be the places that these issues should be resolved. It should be resolved between Indigenous peoples and governments through good faith negotiations. Now, we hope that that table has now been set. But as I said, we've been taking these cases to get to a place where we finally have a negotiation process between the Métis Nation and Canada. And of course, with the most recent case, the Daniels case, along with recent reports from ministerial representative appointed by Canada on Métis rights, Tom Isaac, and a confluence of events, of also political events, such as the election of Justin Trudeau, times have changed on these things. So where this really gets to, though, is a renewed relationship starting in 2015, or at least the beginnings of it, and where we're getting to today. So Prime Minister sends a letter to Minister Bennett of saying one of her mandates are to work on a nation-to-nation basis with the Métis Nation. I think that's really important. You know, we've always seen this, you know, with the Métis or with the Métis people. This government is committed to working with the Métis Nation, as opposed to just other groups or organizations out there that may claim to be quote-unquote Métis. And to renew the relationship based on cooperation, respect for rights, and our international obligations, and a commitment to ending the status quo. Now, those are big, fluffy words, and governments are very good at doing that, especially this government, but we hold out hope that when the rubber hits the road, we actually can change the status quo. So the Métis Nation of Alberta, like always, has been a leader in driving and making use of these opportunities. So in January 2016, signing a MOU to engage in exploratory discussions around how do we move forward on Métis rights, Métis self-government, and all of the issues that you've been asking for to move forward on in generations. And in November of 2017, signing a framework agreement, which really sets out a formal negotiations process to deal with these issues. It's important, and I just want to highlight some of the pieces from the framework agreement. It says one of the goals of a formal negotiations process. So one of the things I just want to say is we've had tripartite processes, and they've always been these, you know, truncated, somewhat teethless processes. They haven't been formal negotiations. First Nations and Inuit have been engaged in formal negotiation processes. We've been kind of in this, you know, kiddie sandbox of just, you know, can we talk about programs and services? Can we talk about devolution? Can we talk about public government? Not necessarily talking about real self-government. And I think that that's what's changed with this, that there's a formal negotiation process in the commitments made within the framework agreement around this. So one of key of it is to renew the nation-to-nation relationship between the Crown and the Métis Nation within Alberta by jointly developing a government-to-government relationship. And you guys know that we get slagged on this all the time. You know, I represent the Manitoba Métis Federation. They, you know, governments or industry will say, oh, you're just an Inc. You're just a corporation. In Alberta, it's, oh, you're just an association. And what this process is about is that metamorphosis of converting from an association. Now, we always believe that we have the inherent right of self-government. We are a government. We are just presently using a corporate vehicle or an association vehicle to advance our interests. But we always know that it's not about someone giving us self-government or recognizing our self-government. It's actually about finally getting to a place where we've established that nation-to-nation relationship where we're not struggling for recognition anymore. And in addition, there's 3 components to the framework agreement: giving expression to the inherent right of the Métis Nation within Alberta to self-government and self-determination, recognizing Section 35 Métis rights, and also exploring with a view of settling outstanding claims, including those flowing from the Dominion Lands Act, which are Métis scrip. And importantly, I think that there's some substantive commitments and timely commitments here. The parties agree that, within the first year of the agreement, so the clock is ticking since November, that they will attempt to reach an agreement in principle in recognizing self-government for the Métis Nation within Alberta that will address, amongst other things, the role, functions, and jurisdiction of the MNA, including its relationships with other governments. And so this is a substantive commitment of actually moving from that previous patronizing, you know, oh, you're nothing more than an association relationship, to a government-to-government relationship. And I think that is what is so significant about the recent agreements and the change that you're seeing flowing from Daniels and also the court cases. What is self-government? And I do just want to talk about this. People throw this term around, and it's kind of one of those consultant speak words sometimes, I think, and I just want to break it down of what it actually means for the Métis themselves vis-a-vis self-government. The Métis Nation's right to self-government inheres within us as a people, and the right is held by all peoples in international law around the world, including indigenous peoples. And the right rests with the people as a collective, not within individuals, not within site-specific locations. It rests within the Métis Nation. And that's why it's called our inherent right. It's, if you're a people, you got it. And you never give it up, never goes away. It's deep, it inheres within you. Understanding our self-government is not about getting others, is not dependent on others giving it to us or recognizing it. The legitimacy of our self-government comes from our people believing in, supporting it, and relying on it and participating in it. It's the people in this room that make Métis self-government real. It's not because Ottawa says it exists. It's because the Métis people believe in the Métis Nation of Alberta, whether it's participating in locals, whether it's participating within the regions, whether it's coming together through annual general assemblies, whether it's coming out in elections. That's what makes our self-government real. It's the people. It's not the institutions or structures. It's the people who drive it and who are the engine for our self-government. And this is what has sustained us in the face of colonialism, disrespect, and internal divisions. And self-government is really about how an Indigenous nation chooses to govern itself, how it makes decisions, how it chooses leaders, how it relates to other governments. And more importantly, it's about the relationship that the nation has to its individual citizens. What are the inherent rights and freedoms you have as a citizen of the Métis Nation? How the limitations imposed on the nation's governments, who are the citizens of the Métis Nation. Those are the key questions that you need to answer. Now, over the years, the Métis Nation has answered many of those questions, and they lie within your current bylaws, or they lie within the conventions or your histories. But now is the moment in time where for most nations or peoples, where this is embedded is in a constitution. And right now, the Métis Nation of Alberta doesn't have one. You have bylaws, which sets out some of these structures, but it's still underneath the Alberta Societies Act, not recognized and ratified by the people themselves. And I think this next stage in your history is about finally getting to that constitution, because constitutions are considered a reflection of a people's or a nation's soul, and it has to be driven from the people themselves. And I think that the MNA is about to embark on these consultations to really have the discussion about saying, you know, look at Riel had to, back in 1869, he had to go to 3 ongoing meetings to finally get a mandate to establish a provisional government. He had to go to the people to do it. And this process you're about to engage in, you have to go to the people. And ultimately, it will be the citizens of the Métis Nation of Alberta who will decide whether they will ratify a constitution and move from the shackles of an association to a Métis Nation government. And I think that that's quite an exciting time in our history, and we've never had that opportunity before. A Métis Nation of Alberta constitution, well, what do constitutions do? I'm not going to get too much into this, but they legitimize political authority. They protect individual rights and freedoms by limiting the power of the government. They identify the powers, different political actors, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary. They express basic beliefs and symbolism. They provide political stability, so you're not fighting about bylaws, which you like to do. I just like to know, and they also set out a process for making major changes and establishing mechanisms for dispute resolution. And these are just some of the things that need to be found within a constitution. And I think you already have various components that would go within your constitution. These are pieces of your self-government right now, but what you really need to decide is not from a bylaw perspective, but from a constitution perspective, how are you going to govern tomorrow and for generations to come? So now you have local citizenship, lawmaking authority, relationships with other governments, rights of citizens, regional councils, provincial council, and it's really about creating a modern day Métis government. And I think that we have to have some serious discussions about what that looks like. How do we engage young people in our government today who live on their iPhones as opposed to wanting to come out to community meetings? And I think that in order to become a real government, you have to find a way to make it real and to make people want to participate within it. And some of the old ways of the past are great, but but we also have to recognize that we're building a government for the future. And we have to recognize about what our lives are today and how the Métis Nation will advance for generations to come. In developing a constitution, you have to look at principles about where the constitution, of what are key principles, whether it's democratic governance structures. This is, one of the tried and true things that you always see throughout the Métis Nation. We believe in democracy. We also believe people have a right to be heard, even if we don't agree with their opinions. Riel had to go for 3 solid days, and the English half-breeds in the settlement didn't want to establish a provisional government. They were concerned about it. And through persuasiveness and through debate and through talking, they brought people along to say, no, we will finally establish a provisional government. And that's the important point, of that the people have to want it. If the people don't want it, you're not going to be able to create it. That it's rooted in our customs and traditions, not some third party being imposed on us. It's grounded in our nationhood, our rights, and our homeland. And it's about the locals, regions, and provincial bodies working together. And what that mix looks like going into the future, no one's sure, but this is the process to begin that discussion. And so I think that I just want to say how it's different. Of right now you have MNA members, you have bylaws, you have MNA governance and structures and institutions set out in those bylaws. And where you want to move towards are Métis Nation citizens, a constitution ratified by those citizens, and a third order of Métis government recognized within this country. Where are we? We're in the process of, one, MNA has to do its homework of getting to that constitution. In addition, we're engaging in discussions with the federal government on how you negotiate self-government. And I kind of think of it as this, like you have 3 concentric circles. You have what is the Métis Nation's jurisdiction, what is the Manitoba, sorry, I have the wrong one in here. What's the Alberta government's jurisdiction? And what's the federal government's jurisdiction? And what you're negotiating is between how those jurisdictions will work together. And I like this visual of a tree of what we're actually building. So if you think about it, the roots of the tree are our history and our inherent right to self-government. So whether it's the laws of the hunt, whether it's these 2 provisional governments established, that's what anchors us. Because as that saying, you need to know where you come from in order to know where you're going. And we can never forget what anchors us and grounds us as the Métis Nation. And what we're really now starting to build, though, is that trunk of the tree, which is our constitution and which is the recognition of our self-government, which is anchored on that history, those customs, those traditions. And we want a strong trunk of the tree because that's what's going to hold us up for generations to come. And all of those branches, and you already have some of those branches of the tree already in some of the programs and services that are delivered, but instead of programs and services, we really wanted to start talking about jurisdiction. This isn't just, us delivering a program for others. This is about how do we design something that works for our own people based upon Métis jurisdiction, not some delegated or subordinate authorization from another level of government. And I think these are the fundamental pieces that we're building. So what happens next? Well, I think this is the starting point. You signed in November 2017 of extensive province-wide consultations, the development of a constitution. And I also just want to say this, everyone always gets nervous, oh, you know, we haven't heard about this. At the end of the day, you're going to have to ratify it. It's not going to just be at an annual General Assembly about who's the loudest at a microphone. It's going to be rank and file citizens, 35,000 plus of you, who are going to have to go out and vote. And it's the same way as I told you that story about how Riel had to go to 3 debates to finally get the mandate to establish a provisional government. If the people don't want it, if you're not ready to move from an association to a government, or it's still not in our heart and soul that we want to finally achieve that vision that our ancestors had, then we won't ratify it. But I can tell you that at the end of the day, this is going to be a key piece in the Métis Nation's history about whether you move from an association to a government. And I think it's an exciting time. Also, you're going to have to deal with the ratification of an MNA Canada self-government agreement, but part and parcel of getting to that self-government agreement is getting to a constitution. And finally, recognition of a Métis Nation of Alberta government. And I very much look forward to that day, so I'm never in courts again fighting about bylaws. I think the time is right, and I think that our nation's ready to finally renew that relationship and finally put in place a government-to-government relationship with other governments like our ancestors envisioned. Thanks very much, and look forward to the next part of the workshop. Thanks.